So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 20th session of the Research, Reflection and Practices Guest Lecture Series. Today we have Dr. R.L. Stirrat, formerly of the University of Sussex, to speak to us about small-scale fishing in the northwestern province in Sri Lanka. First of all, I warmly welcome Dr. Stirrat to SEPA. He's actually not unfamiliar to SEPA because he has been here and done many lectures for SEPA. And he has agreed to give this talk while on holiday, and I'm very appreciative of the fact that he took the invitation without hesitation, and thank you very much. So let me just briefly talk about his work and work interests. He's an anthropologist by training, and he's also a development specialist. He taught anthropology and development studies, as well as he was responsible for a series of projects on religion in Sri Lanka, aquaculture in sub-Saharan Africa, coastal zone management in Sri Lanka, aquatic animal health in Southeast Asia, and development personnel in Colombia. He was a professor in anthropology at the University of Sussex and held many key positions, including being the head of the anthropology department. He was the director of the Center for Culture and Development and the director of development studies. He was a Leverhulme Emeritus Fellow in 2015, an interesting fellowship which has brought him back to Sri Lanka to study something that he studied 40 years ago, which we will talk more about that as we in his talk. So Dr. Stirrat has well over 25 years of experience in the development field and has worked with a wide-ranging number of clients, including DFID, FAO, IFAD, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the EC, as well as various private consultancy companies and NGOs. This work has mainly been, of course, concerned with the social aspects of development and the evaluation of projects and programs. Upon retirement, he continues to work as a development consultant.
Okay. No more.
No more. Okay, says no more. Okay, so he has a number of publications, books, journals, book chapters, which sum to at least about 50. And you can see for each decade, he has a couple of publications, which I think is really remarkable. If you look at his CV, you'll see that. I've just picked out a few of the more important ones, publications. On the Beach, Fishermen, Fishwives, and Fisher Traders in Post-Colonial Lanka, which is actually the research that he talks about 40 years ago, the research that he did 40 years ago, and which he revisits again from 2015 onwards. Then Power and Religiosity in a Post-Colonial Setting, Sinhala Catholics in Contemporary Sri Lanka, Charity, Philanthropy and Development in Colombo, Sri Lanka, which was a fairly recent project, which he did with Filippo Sella and T. Whitker. And more relating to the topic is talking about today, again, Fishing, the Pork Bay Fishing Dispute, Revisited, published in 2018. Dr. Stirrat is a graduate of the University of Cambridge with a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and a PhD in Anthropology. So once again, I welcome Dr. Stirrat. Thank you very much once again for accepting our invitation, and over to you to talk about small-scale fishing in the northwestern province.
Thank you. First of all, the ritual apologies. I was only asked 2 days ago to do this, and this was a wee bit of a surprise to me. But my arm was twisted a few times, and so I'm here. I don't know how long I'm going to talk for, and obviously this is not a polished talk. It's what came to mind, well, basically yesterday afternoon. Now, the background to this is that I'm interested here in the long, well, I'm interested more generally in the long-term processes of social change, particularly with fishing and particularly in the Northwest Province, in that strip, north basically of Negombo, up to Puttalam, and to a lesser extent beyond up to Mannar. But I'm basing it very much on a view from one village. This isn't a village study, this is just the place where I happen to be based. It's a village called Ambacandawila, which is just south of Chilau. I've known Ambacandawila now for 50 years. I first went there in 1969 when I was doing my doctoral research. So this part of what I'm be talking about today is to do with my own data from then and from later. I visited the place often. We did research there in the late 90s. And we did another piece of research there in 2015-16. So that's the field data that my talk's based on. And as well as that, there's documentary data, what records I could find, the government reports, GAs, AGAs reports, odds and ends in Catholic records, because these fishermen are all Catholic in the area I'm talking about, and anything else I could find or have found so far. And the picture that emerges is not surprisingly a continuous process of change. And that there's nothing constant. All the time there is change. And this change in Ambacandawila is generally a matter of people reacting to changes in the wider economy and the wider polity. So it's a matter of change. And this is what I want to stress all the way through, processes of change. Now, Ambacandawila was founded in the 1880s, as far as I can make out. Before that, it seems to be a desert, basically, scrubby jungle on the sandy peninsula between the sea and Chilau Lagoon. And around that time, 2 groups of people moved into the area. The first one were fishermen and their families from Negombo. And they themselves were mainly descendants of people from India who'd come over in the first half of the 19th century. So you've got a good process of migration of fishers from South India into the Negombo area and then up the coast. And this has continued. Even in 1970, I knew men who'd been born in India, but who were married to women from this area and claimed to be Sinhalese. Secondly, that's one group of people. The other group of people who were there was a group of, they were small-scale farmers. They laboured on the coconut estates. They picked up odds and ends of jobs, land-based jobs. And they lived towards the lagoon side, and the fishermen from the Negombo settled down on the seaward side of the peninsula. So there's 2 groups there. But by the turn of the century, by 1900, and increasingly after that, those people who were working on the estates or working as small-scale farmers, they had started fishing. They moved into fishing. They moved in because it was a higher income and it was easy to enter fishing. So in other words, these are people with no fishing background, but they became fishers. That perhaps to say that the sort of fishing that was going on was very small-scale fishing using tepangs, rafts like the catamaran you get in the north of Sri Lanka, using nets which people made themselves, and these tepangs were powered either by paddles or by sail. So it's a very simple technology, but people were moving in already. It was already generating a higher income than other ways of earning a living. And what was driving that was the demand for dried fish and to a lesser extent fresh fish in the inland areas in the coconut estates, which were developing all the way up Northwest Province during that period, and further away the tea estates inland. So it's the growth of those estates which created a commercial drive, which created the market for fish, which both attracted people from the Gumbo to settle down here and people to move into fishing. Now this process continued. By the time I knew Ambacundabula in 1970, around 70% of the population were fishers, right? Households depended directly on fishing. Right? And about half of these people came from families whose parents or grandparents had been fishermen. The rest came from non-fishing backgrounds. What was also apparent by 1970 was increasing differentiation amongst the fishermen, amongst fishing households. Now, this wasn't a matter of a differentiation between the owners of gear and people who worked the gear, but it was rather a differentiation between some households which had managed to accumulate more gear and therefore could take part in a range of different sorts of fishing, and also households which had a relatively good proportion, if you want to put it good, of young and married men in the household who could fish. This is crucial. The more male offspring you had, the richer the household became. Unfortunately, they married out and set up their own households, but for that period, they would become rich. It was also helped by the new forms of fishing that were coming into play. Because around in the 1960s, two things happened. First of all, nylon nets came in, rather than the old cotton nets, which were made at home. And nylon nets were much more efficient, and how many nets you had depended on how if you could buy them or not. Whereas the old cotton nets, you had to make yourself. So richer families, richer households were able to buy more nets for more species of fish in a greater net area, and so they became richer. That was one. The second one was that in the 60s, outboard engines became available and popular very rapidly. And these you tied to the back of big tepuns, and you could go much deeper out to sea. You could exploit new fishing grounds. And this again would generate greater incomes. So there was a sort of tendency for relatively wealthy households, i.e. ones with lots of sons, to be able to take advantage of these new methods of fishing which were coming in then. So you have this increasing differentiation. But overall, when I was there in 1970, 71, when I first was there, fishing was a relatively remunerative way of earning a living. It paid better than most other ways that these people had. There were few opportunities which would generate a greater income than fishing. So you even got minor bureaucrats giving up and moving into fishing because the incomes they would get were greater. Fishermen were doing relatively well. The poorest people in the village were people who didn't fish. They were the ones who were labourers. They were the ones who worked these scraps of land along the coast, the shore of the lagoon. And they were the ones who were caught because they didn't have the resources to move in, especially now that nylon nets were the dominant way of catching fish. Now, from the 1970s onwards, demands of the wider economy, the global economy, became increasingly important in Ambacundabula and increased economic differentiation. And there were a number of things. Three I'll mention. First was the demand for labour overseas. Secondly was the international demand for prawns. And thirdly, there were the internal changes in the Sri Lankan economy, which I'll talk about later. Now, migration, as I mentioned already, people who founded Abercrombie, at least part of them, their ancestors came from India. Migration is nothing new. People were moving around this coast. Secondly, there was also seasonal migration. People from Abercrombie would fish, would move up to Manor at certain times of the year. They'd move across to the east coast at certain times of the year. And in 1970, a few families, a few households from Abercrombie had permanently moved to fishing settlements along the Carpathia Peninsula. So migration was going on all the time. But after 1970s, particularly the 1980s and 1990s, international migration became increasingly important in Abercrombie. And there's two, and I think all the way along that coastal belt, two main foci, as you know. One, the Gulf. And from Abercrombie, very few women went as housemaids. I don't know why, but very few went. People who went from Abercrombie were men. They went on fixed-term contracts, and they did their job and came back. They might go for a number of contracts, but that was it. That was one group. The other group went to Europe, especially Italy. And the character of migration there was very different, because it wasn't single men. It was rather households that went, well, men and women went together and had children, and often brought up the children in Italy. Much longer term migration. There's great uncertainty as to whether they will ever return. And as far as I know, and last time I was there, which is 3 or 4 years ago, I suppose now, very, very few have returned to live. They have stayed in Europe. Now, the richest households were in the best position to support migration. They had the resources to pay the necessary travel costs, the necessary bribes, and so on. This was especially true in the case of Europe. And the people who went to Europe, in general, came from the richest households. Ones who went to the Gulf, usually not from the wealthiest households. Now, the incentive behind going, why did people go? Well, yes, there were economic considerations, but there are many others as well. Gulf in particular, I think they went for economic reasons. But people who went to Europe often went for a whole range of much less measurable reasons. They went for fun, they went for adventure, they went to try something different, and often they enjoyed it. Now, the impact on Abercrombie, there's various impacts this had. The first thing that happened was obviously that it was the wealthiest households who tended to have offspring who moved abroad. And this created a shortage of labour in fishing, in those households at least. So households, old fishing households, the richest ones, would often give up fishing, or rather downscale fishing, because they didn't have the labour resources in the household to support fishing activities. Remittances, well, remittances are not all that common in Abercrombie, where people do not send money back. Now, I say that particularly true of Europe. People go to Europe, tend to go as domestic units, and they keep their money and they use it. They'll send money back to an aged parent or from an emergency, but on the whole, there are no regular remittances. It's different from the ones who go to the Gulf, because then it tends to be men and they're sending it back to their wives. But that's there's two very different patterns all the way through. And the most striking thing to me about this is there is very little investment from the earnings that are made abroad in what you might call productive capital in Abercrombie. People who go abroad aren't investing money in businesses. There's one or two examples of people who did. There's a few cases of people who did and failed, but in general, people don't. Where you get investment from overseas migrants, it tends to be in houses. And those houses often just stay empty. So that's one, is migration. That had a direct effect on fishing, especially on the wealthiest fishing households who, in effect, moved out of fishing because they didn't have the required labour within the household. Secondly, there was prawns. In the 1990s, there was a gold rush along that coast of small-scale prawn farming. Why this happened, I can talk about if you like, but the small-scale producers in Abercrombie, all the coastal belt along the lagoon, which had been mangrove swamp, old paddy lands, some coconut lands, became prawn farms. Along the beach, you had a whole series of prawn hatcheries, all the way along there. And again, it was the richer households who were able to take advantage of these new opportunities. They had the capital, and it had to have big capital, much more capital than you needed to set up in fishing, to create these prawn farms and also hatcheries, which are even more expensive. And it's a very interesting process of how the whole industry took off from the role of what are called consultants as advisors to would-be farmers and hatchery owners. Now, prawn farming, there were some successes, but in general, it was a failure. In general, farming led to major losses, and people had to move out of prawn farming. A lot of them had to. Hatcheries were different. I don't know why. Hatcheries, people in Abercrombie actually retained control of most of the hatcheries all the way through. And what happened in the farms was that government intervention reduced risk. There's very high risk in prawn farming, but government intervention by introducing standards of maintenance of the ponds, of introducing standards to control use of chemicals, because they wanted to supply the international market, meant that risk went as the old prawn producers who lived in the village, as they faced economic problems, so outside people moved in and bought these small prawn farms. And by 2015, there had been a shift from local people owning around 80% of all the farms in the late 1990s to only owning about a quarter by 2015. They just lost out. Right? So again, this outside opportunities, yes, they did create great opportunities for some, and some took great advantage of it in the hatcheries and the farms, but it was the rich households that benefited most. Poor households didn't have the resources to run these farms for long, and they were the ones who lost out most. While the poorest of all, they got very little openings, very little advantage from it. And finally, there was the general changes in the Sri Lankan economy, which you know all about. Things like the garment industry, banks, finance houses, the retail sector, all that sort of thing. This created a lot of people from Abercrombie, young people moved into these new areas. Again, the attraction wasn't necessarily higher income. You know, fishing was still pays relatively well. It generates good incomes. But what is attractive is that it's higher status and it's a much easier life. You know, going out fishing at 3 in the morning is not very pleasant. Having fish is not very pleasant. So the result was by 2015-16 was a much more occupationally diverse place than it was in when I first knew it in 1970. Rather than 70% of people being fishing, now it was probably under 40%. Secondly, economic differentiation is much greater in terms of wealth and income than it was in 1970, and probably much more than it was in 20, 30 years before that. And thirdly, today's fishermen in Abercrombie Many of them, even more than when I knew it in 1970, come from non-fishing backgrounds. The rich fishermen, rich fishing households have tended to move out of fishing, where poor non-fishing people households have moved into fishing. It's not as easy as it was in the first half of the 20th century, because now you've got to buy your nets, there's the expensive engines, there's the expensive fiberglass boats, which are now widely used. But you've still got poor people from non-fishing backgrounds moving into fishing, while the rich move out of fishing. And this comes out very clearly in genealogies. You can, one of the things being an anthropologist I did, collect genealogies. If you look back 2 or 3 generations in the people who originated and its ancestors came from the Gumbo, they were all fishing. And then this generation are moving. If you look at people in the other half of the village, which was originally non-fishing, you look at them and you go back to around 1900, they were non-fishers. And then you find them fishing. But what's interesting is that a generation or 2 after, they too have moved out of fishing. In other words, fishing is a sort of bridge. It's a way by which, or this sort of fishing anyway, is a way by which poor people can move in to fishing. They can earn a decent income. They can at times save money, and they can build up some sort of wealth compared with what they had before. Not I had more to say, but that seems to be verse run out. So, in other words, what we have, as an anthropologist, when I first went to Aberconderwydde, I thought I was seeing a static village being destroyed by change or modified by change. Now I see what I saw in 1970 is purely a vignette on a little look at a little window into a process which goes on from at least the mid-19th century, back perhaps 1800, of continual change, of people moving into fishing and out of fishing, of people coming into the place and moving out of the place as migrants. I can talk about other things, people from Aberconderwydde now settled in Mara, settled on the East Coast. The whole thing has changed. And to understand a village like Aberconderwydde, it isn't a matter of understanding its inner dynamics. It's a matter of understanding the way people react to, take advantage of, whose lives are modified by these much more global changes. And I'm going to stop there because I've run out of notes to